Hi, everyone, and welcome to our featured event today, the first event of our speaker series that's going to continue on for the rest of the academic year. The title of the event is Latino Activism and Electoral Politics, Lessons for Future Leader in Chicagoland and Beyond. Lessons for Future Leaders and in Chicagoland and Beyond. The sponsor for this event is the Center for Latino Research, abbreviated as CLR, that strives to open and sustain dialogues which foster the empowerment and advancement of Latinx communities. To that end, the CLR creates learning opportunities for students and supports scholars in their research, while also focusing collaborative relationships with local, national, and international research partners. We also publish an award-winning scholarly journal, Dialogo, and sponsor many activities on campus, including film series and speaker series. So the CLR, the Center for Latino Research, is a sponsor for this, for today's event, as well as the Political Science Department of DePaul University. CLR, the Center for Latino Research, will have two events that I want to make everyone in the public aware of. On October 21st, we'll be having a conversation and writing workshop with creative writer Elizabeth Velasquez, a creative writer that has just published a young adult novel called When We Make It, about gentrification in the Brooklyn neighborhood. Also on October 21st, the DePaul University Office of Institutional Diversity and Equity is hosting the annual Dolores Huerta event. Guest speaker will be Dr. Marisol Morales, a DePaul graduate, to provide examples of what our alums do and how they remain politically engaged with Latinidad. Here we have our speaker for today. His name is Ismael Cuevas. He's a director of external affairs for the Committee on Workforce Development in Chicago City Council. He has worked on improving quality of life for Chicago's South Side, Black and Latino neighborhoods for the past decades in different capacities. As chief of staff in the office of City Council member Susan Sedlowski Garza of the 10th Ward, Mr. Cuevas has leveraged his graduate training in Mexican American and Latino studies to represent and also carry out social and racial justice initiatives. He has emerged as a thought leader in Black and Brown communities, making him critical to the politics of people of color in the city of Chicago and its outlying areas. I am your master of ceremonies, Dr. Joe Robert Tafoya. I'm an assistant professor here at DePaul University. My research is focused on raising Latino political engagement, understanding evolving views toward immigrants, and advancing integration of recent arrivals to the United States. Myself, I'm a first generation in higher education. So my parents were also immigrants. And I teach courses on Latino politics, public opinion, and also best practices for carrying out political science research in communities of color. My mission is to inspire new generations of scholars and activists to change or to challenge the American political system to live up to its ideals. This awesome responsibility inspires me to identify areas that are ripe for leaps forward. And so that's why we're here today. We've identified, right, that at the national level, the focus when it comes to Latinos in regards to politics is voter mobilization and representation, again, nationally. The media and various scholarly outlets have paid very little attention to Latino mobilization, political engagement at local levels, right? And we are blessed, we are glad, we are happy that we are in a large metropolitan area like Chicago and its outlying suburbs that we call Chicagoland, because there are so many opportunities for Latino, Latinx, Latina community members to become involved, right? We have incredible evidence of voter mobilization, of the election of Latino representatives for the first time in various city councils around Chicagoland. And we have here Mr. Cuevas to share that experience, right? To share his experience in city government, as well as being a thought leader in Black and Brown communities. And so here, what we're doing here in this event, again, titled Latino Activism and Electoral Politics, Lessons for Future Leaders in Chicagoland and Above and Beyond, our purpose here is to capture this lightning in a bottle, right, that we call Latino politics, specifically at the local level. Again, we are largely unaware of what occurs here at the local level. So here, for this discussion, we are going to focus on representation, and the meaningfulness of having Latino, Latinx, Latina, Hispanic community members in elected government. Now, Mr. Cuevas himself is not an elected leader, right? But he is a staffer. He's been a part of the district offices, right? The council member, the ward. He works in the city council here in City Hall. And so, yeah, here, the other thing about this discussion, thank you everyone for coming. I have in the audience about 15 to 20 folks of a Latino politics class that will be here observing and asking questions on behalf of folks at home. And with that said, I'll hand it off to Mr. Cuevas to really kind of illustrate what we're dealing with here.
Thank you, Joe. So again, my name is Ismael Cuevas. I grew up on the southwest side of Chicago. I currently work for Alderman Garza, as he said, on the southeast side of Chicago. But I live in Pilsen. I commute all around the city. I went to University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then we actually met each other at University of Texas, Austin. So it's really hard for people when people say, "Where are you from? Where do you live?" I'm like, I have to give you all the details because if not, you're gonna get confused. But in this topic of Latino representation is really important for me because it's not only just about like who's in office, like is it the color of our skin, is it our gender, do they look like us, right? But how they relate to our neighborhoods, how they what informs them on like how they're going to make their decisions as such. And I wanted to give you all an anecdote about Latino representation and just kind of how I became involved and what motivated me. When my mom and my dad crossed the border and they brought me here as a young child, basically as an infant, I was 1 year old. I still remember, as growing up in Chicago, basically when you get your sense of memory, right? At like age 4, 5, 6, I can't remember exactly when. But I always remember this one time that my mother went to a government office. I was a child. It's like one of the first memories. But what really struck me is remembering my mom leaving this government office crying because a government employee basically asked her why she didn't speak English, and that made her feel bad for not speaking English. Again, my mom had only been in the United States in Chicago for a few years, and as a working class mother, immigrant mother, right, learning English wasn't necessarily a priority. So that kind of memory really left an imprint on me, right? Going to this government office where nobody in there looks like you, and you don't know if they're necessarily advocating for you, even though it's the government and they're supposed to represent you. So I always told myself, and I've told this to, I actually had a training session with new aldermen and new chief of staffs when they got elected in 2019, and I gave this example because this was really a way that I've tried to form the offices that I worked in, or when I've gotten the opportunity to be a manager in some of these offices, like, hey, we want this not just to be like the alderman's office, but we want people to come in here and feel connected to us, right? Obviously, not everyone's gonna want to hear the things that we have to say. Sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's good. Hopefully, it's the majority good. But it was important that representation looks like us. So I just wanted to give that anecdote.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating. Right, so we think so much about Latinos voting, GOTV, get out the vote, right? The Latino vote could be crucial in the following election, is what news media is largely represent. But when we talk about the extension or the continuation of voting, right, that gets at representation, that gets at the election of folks that will represent us, right? And there are two modes in political science research discussing the types of representation. We think of descriptive representation, but also, and more importantly, substantive representation. Now, what's interesting in the United States, in the United States Congress, but also among legislative offices on from the local level to state governments, is that substantive representation is typically provided by community members. And so in this example that Ismael describes to us, right, having someone that potentially, for example, speaks Spanish, someone that is bilingual in that office, could have been critical, right? And so, we're not tooled to look at that, right, with the various sort of frames and paradigms that we currently have. Ismael was kind enough to put together for us a sort of a graphical tabulation, a representation discussing, right, the proportion of Latinos in a given township's population proportional to the representation in those city governments. And one of the things that's striking about the statistics that he's going to share is the lack of representation. Now we hear about this, we hear a lot about this, we need to get more people like us there, right? But on the day-to-day, right, on life outcomes, how does that determine people's life experiences?
Yeah, so I'm gonna just a quick question to the audience. What do you all think is the most Latino city in the state of Illinois? Anyone?
LA. Oh, in Illinois, sorry.
The most Latino city in Illinois?
Chicago.
Whoa.
The most Latino city in Illinois.
Cicero.
Sorry, we're having technical
Yep,
difficulties.
as whoever's listening, it's Cicero. Cicero is the most Latino city in Illinois. Then it's Melrose Park, Summit, Park City, Berwyn, North Lake, Stickney, Posen, Waukegan. Chicago isn't up until number 45 of Latino percentage of Latinos in the city. So for example, Cicero is 89% Latino, whereas Chicago is 31% Latino, right? And Melrose Park is 75%, Summit is 74%, Park City. But what was really interesting when I started crunching when I started looking at the websites of the mayor of each of these municipalities is how the numbers don't match. And by that, I mean like how many Latinos were in the city council or in the board of the trustees of a given suburb or city. So for example, Cicero, that is 89% Latino, only has 25% Latino representation in its city council. Melrose Park, which is 75% Latino, has only 42%. Summit, Illinois, that is 74% Latino, only has 14% Latino representation in its board of trustees or city council and so forth. And here in Chicago, we're at about 24% representation in a city that's 31% Latino.
Oh, so that's really interesting. So it appears that in Chicago, the gap between, or rather the proportion, right, between Latino population, Latino representation is actually smaller than it is for these outlying townships. What I found fascinating, right, about Cicero, right, that's 89% Latino with only 25% representation. Melrose Park, 75% Latino with only 43% representation. And Illinois, Summit, Illinois, 74%, only 14% representation, right? Is that this disparity, this gap, is something, of course, that we don't pay very much attention to. But at the national level, right, the various voting rights acts are concerned with creating, or rather diminishing barriers to voting, but also creating minority-majority districts, right? These are areas where Latino representation for Black and Brown communities that also benefit Latino representation. These folks are in the plurality and allows the election of a person that looks like those communities. And it appears as though those reforms at the national level, right, to be able to encourage Latino representation haven't really trickled down, right, onto the state level, perhaps the local level. So could you describe to us potentially what is necessary, right? What needs to be true for Latino representation to really kind of increase in numbers?
Yeah, so something that's really important when it comes to growing this, right? So, normally we would say we need a substantial Latino population, right? But I think these examples demonstrate that even when you have a substantial majority Latino population, it doesn't necessarily reflect in the leadership of the city or the municipality, right? So that means that there's other factors involved, right? For example, you need to have either an organized Latino electorate or your constituents have to be organized. And if not organized, to have the potential to organize. That's a really important point when it comes to not just city of Chicago politics, but for those of you who grew up in other areas of Illinois, right? Is there community organizations that allow me to register to do voter mobilization or registering people to vote?
What are some examples of community organizations?
Some examples of community organizations that are doing that, for example, here in Chicago, Latino Progresando. And then you also have local kind of citywide organizations that are doing this kind of work. But also you all have the power to register folks to vote. And I think that's one thing that I've been really a proponent of, right? From where one of the first few jobs that I got right after college was basically registering folks to vote for an aldermanic office. So I remember getting, there was a grant by the MICFA Challenge, which is like a Chicago organization for civic engagement. And we were able to register like thousands of people to vote in Little Village. And I kind of took that model and applied it to different parts of the city, right? When I started working on the east side of Chicago, even in my own neighborhood in the southwest side of Chicago, literally going around the block and registering people to vote. Those are like some examples to give you all as students, and then those viewers are like, what can I do like immediately, right? So that's really important. Forming independent political organizations has been crucial to getting Latinos elected in Chicago.
You talked about an organization earlier that had a Spanish name. Could you describe to that a little?
Latinos Progresando. Latinos Progresando is a community organization that's been working on civic engagement. They also have other initiatives, education and things like that. But those and there's literally dozens of them across the city that folks can get involved in. But the point of the independent political organization is important because the first Latino elected officials in Chicago came from IPOs. IPOs are independent political organizations that folks like you and I and those who are listening to us created because they wanted an alternative way to enter politics, right? Back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, if you were Latino in any of the Latino neighborhoods in Chicago, if you weren't going through the typical means of politics, aka the Democratic Party, folks had to create their organization. So you have people like Chuy Garcia,
That's right.
right, who became one of the first Latino elected officials in Illinois because he had the IPO. And then these IPOs then began creating kind of like rainbow coalitions, black and brown solidarity in the neighborhoods because we don't live in vacuums, right? All of our neighborhoods are, even though we're the most segregated city, we still have to work together.
One of the things that I'm struck with here, Ismael, is that we're used to sort of, historically kind of thinking about constituencies of color, right? Black and brown communities particularly, as traditional supporters of the Democratic Party, right? And one of the things that's important about this key term here, independent political organizations, is that they're independent, right? How are they formed? What's the role of the political party? And does the political party, the Democratic Party specifically, listen to these folks?
Yeah, in my own experience of working with, so it's interesting because I actually I did a lot of research on IPOs, but then once I got to Chicago, I started becoming involved in different IPOs around the city. And it's really interesting to see the dynamics of those IPOs, right? So like for any of you who live in whatever neighborhood that you live in or whatever suburb that you live in, you can create these things independent of the Democratic Party. But there's those organizations are intended, one, for you to kind of have your own board of directors, right? Your own bylaws, right? Your own kind of governing statutes of who the elected official, who their constituent looks like, how you serve them. And I'm not going to lie, there's definitely clashes between the Democratic Party and the IPOs, right? But that was the way that these first Latino elected officials got in there. Mm-hmm. And now here in Chicago, you see a lot of progressive elected officials, a lot of progressive aldermen having to go the route of creating these independent political organizations or just organizations outside of the Democratic Party to be able to gain entrance or to gain representation and to gain support from the community.
So what you're talking about is self-starting campaigns by people, by community members potentially. What does it take for folks to self-select into this?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about this is that people, there's always people who like, they're like, I really want to go into politics, and then there's people who are like, I don't know if this is what I want to do, right? And I think it's been, if you look at kind of like elected officials around the city, you have all kinds of possibilities, right? For example, in the southeast side of Chicago, you had the first teacher to be elected as an alderwoman. You have on the southwest side of Chicago the first state rep, who used to be a college counselor at a high school, becoming a state rep, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be people who are like politically inclined. I think it's people who have the ability to say, you know what, I'm going to put in this amount of work, knocking on doors, visiting churches, meeting with community organizations, to be able to kind of gather that support from the voters.
So what's interesting to me here is that, right, we're used to, in political science research, dividing representation by these types, right? These various types, these bins that people can fall into. But what I'm getting from you is that there's an additional sort of version of representation that is inherently community oriented, right? That folks identify problems that they want to go after and form independent political organizations to address this. That's really fascinating, and I think that in terms of the possibilities, right? The possibilities are limitless in terms of what we can do. I mean, what you're describing is that basically anyone in this room could run for office if they wanted to.
Yeah, and I think what's beautiful about that as well is that we know that our neighborhoods aren't built in silos. We know that our identities aren't, you can't neatly put them in a box. And the beauty of like forming these type of independent organizations is that you kind of get to form who that base is, right? Forming that base is really important because ultimately those are going to be the folks that are going to help you either pass legislation, present legislation to an alderman, or even become an elected official, right? Some ideas start really, really like small, and we can go on this in the future, later in the session. But people could say, well, we need the parks are dilapidated in our neighborhood, or the school buildings are dilapidated, and you kind of start going around building that support, and essentially that kind of leads you kind of start finding oh, this person's really about it. Maybe this person should be the one that should seek office, right? And I think that's what's made Chicago politics very interesting at the local level.
I'd say that Chicago is fascinating in terms of metropolitan areas across the country. There are an amazing amount of elected offices for people to fill, right? So it's been my experience here, and I've also seen it in data, right, that the average age of Latino elected officials here in Chicago tends to be really young. And so I'm curious about a question here that one of our audience members, Julissa Martinez, brings up, right, that Chicago's so big. Right. Why did you focus specifically in its city government? Why did you how did you identify that as a potential avenue, in terms of expanding what's possible for the Latino community?
For myself, I think, and maybe it might be true for the audience members and those who are watching. Growing up on the southwest side of Chicago, I got to live on a daily basis, basically and got to compare and contrast the haves and the have-nots, right? To me, and we kind of talked about this, before the meeting, the north side versus the south side. Who has access to things, who does not have access to things, and who doesn't have it. And I think for me, my experience was that in my neighborhood, in my surrounding area, there was a lot more have-nots than a lot haves. And it just happened that my neighborhood was predominantly Latino, predominantly Mexican, Spanish-speaking, a lot of immigrantes, people who just come. And so for me, I picked that channel because I really wanted to figure out how I can solve those problems in my community. Or if I couldn't solve them, because obviously an individual can't solve all of them, how to find spaces where I was given the freedom or the opportunity to use the capacity to solve those things.
And so perhaps what I'm getting here is that the city government, right, the council member's office, there are resources, right, that you yourself, because you're intimately familiar with the community, might be able to draw or bring toward the community, right? Yeah. And so great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate. Thank you, audience members, for participating. I'm here keeping track of your various contributions, and they're all very engaging. We'll get to those in a short while. What I'm interested in talking about here are sort of the actors, right? The types of representations that officials and individuals provide, specifically when it comes to money in politics, right? Folks in my classes, but also folks, sort of online, publicly air these grievances, right? That elected officials are bought, right? That the various private interests, because of the various donations, force elected officials to vote in a particular way, right? And so that affects the trust that Latino communities or Black and Brown communities have on their elected officials, right? Could we talk about money in politics? Where does it come from? What are its benefits? And is there a morally positive way of looking at this?
Yeah, so money in politics I think that's a problem that we have, obviously not in Chicago and in the country and worldwide, right? And even in Latin America, when I talk to my cousins in Mexico, the first thing they say es que hay mucha corrupción aquí porque el dinero compra los políticos,
All right,
so
translate that.
There's a lot of money here, and a lot of money is being used to buy politicians. So it's really here in Illinois. We are also privileged in the fact that you can use this website called Illinois Sunrise. I think I'm having it wrong, but that website basically gives you the financial document, who are the donors to each of the elected officials in the state of Illinois, and then you can start looking and finding out that some elected officials are being funded by the unions, right? Some elected officials are being funded by corporations, whether at the national level or at the local level. Then you have some elected officials who are funded by literally grassroots, door to door, house to house, like households or local, you know, the local businesses, the mom and pop shop, the restaurants. So that kind of gives you like I usually use that as a way to kind of like see what do my interests align with this elected official? Whereas, you know, they always say follow the paper trail. In this case, you follow the money. And that's been very interesting seeing that here in Chicago.
That's amazing. You know, I've taught political science for about 5 to 6 years, and in various states, and I was unaware, right, that resource was available to us. And it appears as though the city council, the government, and perhaps it sounds like Illinois, right? It's an Illinois service. Yeah. They've made this investment, right, to be able to give folks the tools, you know, to potentially restore, you know, faith in government and restore the faith that people might have in their elected representatives. And so that sounds amazing. One of the other things that I, you know, sort of wondering about are various opportunities, right? Volunteering, as we've discussed, but also the benefits and the resources that local government bodies can bring to us.
Yeah. So, you know, and let me give you this short story of how I started, how I became a chief of staff. So when I graduated from the University of Texas, I came to Chicago. I came back to work here, and I started working in a little village in La Villita as a college counselor at Farragut High School. But my intent was always to figure out how I can work in government or how to work in politics. So I started volunteering on the southeast side of Chicago to elect, or hopefully elect, the first women, the first teacher into office. And after she won, you know, I submitted my application, submitted my resume, and she really liked the fact, I think, and plus you meet people in the campaigns, the fact that I was able to, you know, that I grew up in the neighborhood, that I spoke Spanish, that I had these different abilities to connect with people. Yeah. But what was important there as well is that how you also form not just like the political office itself, but the staff members, right? And I think I always tell people, hey, if you can't get a hold of your elected official, get a hold of the staff members of that office. Oh, wow. And I say that to folks because if you create those relationships, that can also help. That can also be a way in to figure out how else you can get involved, right? So to switch it a little bit in terms of like involvement, becoming an alderman, right, or a Cook County Board of Commissioner or something like that, is one way of getting in office, right? But there's also other levels. So, for example, here in Chicago, in your local schools, at the elementary school, at the high school, you also have local school councils, LSCs. Yeah. And there's literally a community election where folks from the neighborhood come and elect you. So it's like the lowest level of elected official in Illinois, right? Yeah. And that's been really interesting because if you kind of like look at a lot of politicians in Chicago, and you see like their origin, a lot of them actually started in local school councils, and they were and it shows you kind of like the platform that you can get, or even just like how their commitment is to the neighborhood. So that's been really interesting.
And so we know from political science, right, that as soon as people get elected, right, it is possible for them to get reelected. They have an electoral advantage by being a part of the institution. The institution, you know, however big or however small, provides resources for folks to promote their work, right, to be able then to communicate, but to be able ultimately to mobilize people to vote on their behalf. Ms. Jaslyn Hodges here asks, I think, a very, very important question, right? That we have these discrepancies, right, across the various townships in Chicago. Chicago itself, you know, is behind on Latino representation in the city council. If there are so many opportunities, right, for folks to become involved at this very micro local level, why the discrepancy? Like, what's going on? Or is there a lag time? Are Latino communities, you know, kind of struggling to catch up? What are some of the institutional barriers?
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of barriers that we face, right? I think that we face, and I'm talking about not just myself, but some of us here in the classroom, you know, whether it's there's a lot of boards out there that you can get elected to or get, you know, chosen to be a part of, but they're volunteer basis. So if you have kids at home, or if you're a working class and you need, you know, you don't necessarily have, 2 to 3 extra hours a week to participate. So there's economic factors, right? Another thing is transportation factors. Not everybody has a car, can get to a certain place across the city to meet. So there's a lot of setbacks as well. But I wouldn't necessarily say that it's because Latinos can't do it. I think it's just also a matter of like knowing that those things exist.
Yeah.
And what do I mean by that? I always tell folks that in your own communities, there's definitely boards, right? Besides that, there could be like a transportation equity board, right? That is figuring out how can we improve bus routes, or how can we improve access to local parks, or sometimes the own universities are conducting studies in the neighborhood that are going to lead to a report that essentially is going to be used by local government, and they need a steering committee, right? So figuring out ways that you can get involved in those steering committees is another way of kind of like getting involved in the community decision-making process.
This is really fascinating. So I've done GOTV, Get Out the Vote efforts myself. I've run various phone banks on behalf of research projects, but also on behalf of candidates when I was a teenager, back in college as well. And it's really fascinating, right? Because inviting folks into the political community has a major effect, particularly among Latinos, right? And the major setbacks that we get or we have from Latinos or that Latinos sort of deal with and face are basic ones, right? Things that are evident in demography, right? Low education, low income, even generational status, right? Folks of a younger generation, for example, their parents or their grandparents are immigrants, right? And so if that's the case and folks aren't really learning, they're not really socializing into the American political system the way the rest of the American public is undergoing.
I wanted to add a point to that obviously we can't ignore discrimination and we can't ignore racism and things like that. One thing that I always say is that don't let people choose like where you're going to go into, right? There's been a lot of times where I use the word pigeonholed, and I don't know if it's correctly used, but people want to put me like into the diversity and inclusion kind of part of the organization, right? And I don't necessarily always want to do that. Like I want to I want to help make executive decisions, or I want to do the research portion of different organizations or outreach, right? And I say that because that goes either for elected officials or that can go even into the business world for some of you who are seeking careers in different sections, in different areas, right? Finding your way around that, right? Like don't allow the people in power to pigeonhole you in a certain position because of the way that you look. There's a lot more opportunities out there than we think about.
I'm interested in a question that one of our audience members here is asking. Ms. Magoli Garcia, describes, right, what a typical day for you looks like. And one of the things that that stuck with me that you said just now is this idea of studying the problem, right? So of course we all have solutions, right? And the political system is basically a solution looking for a problem, right? People trying to plug in, trying to to get associated with things to get access to political power. And so what does a typical day in the office for you look like? How do you study a problem? And ultimately, how do you advance solutions that are community-based, that benefit the community?
I'm going to give, I like giving this little anecdotes about my life because it just makes it easier to talk to folks. But I wanted to talk about data really quick because when I was in graduate school and even in undergrad, when I was taking sociology or statistics in sociology or statistics in political science, like it was really difficult for me, right?
It's because I wasn't your professor.
It's because you weren't my professor.
Okay.
And you weren't mentoring me.
Okay.
And I was thought like, man, math is really hard for me. But luckily, I went through the strenuous process of taking these classes because once I graduated, I found myself reading a lot of these like documents where like, man, it's a lot of data, but I understood it, right? And so what was important about this is that now when people present problems in the community or come to our office and say, hey, this is a problem that we're facing, the first thing that I do is like, let me look if there's any data on this. Let me look if there's a report published on this. And if there isn't, how do we collect the data? How do we do that? So I'll give you a perfect example. One thing that I started noticing in when I give you the example of the have versus the have-nots, right? And you actually have a map of it in your office. You have a map of bicycle lanes on the north side, and if you flip the map over, it's the south side of Chicago. And if you compare the amount of bicycle lanes on the north side versus the amount of bicycle lanes on the south side, it's a major difference, right? Clearly, the north side has a lot more. It's like dozens of miles more than the south side. And so when you have folks asking for like safe, reliable transportation without having to necessarily always use a car or use a bus, right? That's an example of what I use. Like what I looked at the studies out there that are saying like, what are people's like, what are some barriers that people face when they're going to work or when they're dropping off their kids at child daycare or when students are going to school, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's an example of like using data and using reports to kind of inform like how you're going to problem solve. I think what's made me and my colleagues in the office different is that once we take that data, then we go and meet with folks, or then like I'll give you an example. Right now, I was trying to figure out the best possible route between two neighborhoods, so that high school students can move between them. So I asked the principal of the local high school if she would allow me to go talk to the students during their lunchtime, and kind of do like an informal survey. How do you get to school? What if there was an alternative? What would be the alternative? Do you feel safe walking to school? Do you feel safe taking the bus, or do you want to do you want to use a bicycle, or do you prefer getting picked up and dropped off? Right. So these are all the things that I'm like currently forming right now, but I'm saying that because that's what I feel like that has made me different, but also like my colleagues different. Is that we not only just like theorize it, but we put it in practice, right? And then once we have that community input, you kind of start making decisions at the local level. And I think that when you see elected officials doing that, and I think that more and more are going that route, you create meaningful policy changes at the citywide level.
And you know what's fascinating, at least to me, my initial reaction to some of this that I'm hearing for the first time, thank you for sharing this powerful perspective, is that the focus on bicycle lanes, to me, it sounds like it's the point of departure for a more meaningful conversation, right? If we're thinking about bicycle lanes, we're thinking about infrastructure, right? The amount of resources that are devoted for particular communities, right? And if you have this very clear, very, very clear inequity, right, in terms of the sheer dozens of miles of bike lanes on the north side versus the south side, then you have, potential for, things like disinclusion, sort of issues with representation, right? Bike lanes, for example, if we're thinking about infrastructure, can be a reflection of that. In addition, right, so we're thinking about infrastructure, bike lanes also bring up this element of sustainability, right? And how can our economy, how can our society move towards sort of a greener future, right? What Ismael here has done is use that as a point of departure to leverage, to associate, to connect, right, himself, his entrepreneurship, his city council member's office to the national level Democratic Party agenda, right? And which is, right, increasing infrastructure, making infrastructure more equitable. In addition, expanding sort of this green, sustainable kind of initiative, right, the Biden administration is doing. And right, both of these have elements of racial justice, of social justice. And these are these kinds of creative inputs, right, that we as scholars, as practitioners of Latino politics, even those of us that just might be vaguely interested, right, these are opportunities that we can identify. And right, so I'm interested in these kinds of successes, right, these kinds of successes that we've been able to kind of cull together, right?
And I wanted to add that it doesn't. I gave the bicycle lane because that's kind of what I've been working on recently. But the list can go on, and it could be particular to your neighborhood. It could be, my neighborhood needs more workforce training centers, right? We need more youth after school programming. We need better playgrounds. We need safe drinking water access. We need less violence. I mean, the list can go on and on, right? So that's, and I just I give those examples because I don't want you to, I use the word again, the pigeonhole, right? You don't want to get kind of like stuck in one thing. There's multiple issues, right? But it's always good to find one that you're passionate about, and you're ultimately going to see it's connected to everything, right? It's all part of our neighborhoods, of how they function day to day.
And it's really fascinating, right? If we just think outside the box a little bit, if we're creative enough, right, we might be able to see, right, how some of these general issues, these non-pigeonhole issues, affect communities of color. And like as we pointed out, right, there are gross inequities, and I will call them gross, right, because it affects the quality of life, right, of people down the line. It affects life outcomes, right? It affects even mortality rates and, and all this stuff.
And, when we're talking about representation, right? Once you start digging into like these different issues that are happening in your neighborhood, and you find out that there's a board, or you find out that there's a group of folks who are doing this maybe at a state level or a regional level, you get to these boards and you find out that you're the only Latino there, or the only woman there, or the only Black person there, or the only Native person there, and you're like, wow, right? So this is where I talk about representation. That it doesn't always have to be through the elected official route. Mm-hmm. Once you start seeing these like, as you said, gross efficiencies, you're like, man, it's not just representation at this level, it's literally representation on multiple levels of government, multiple levels of public and private sector. That we need to fulfill.
Yeah, and this is why I am personally in love with Chicago. I'm from Los Angeles, but I love Chicago, right? Because of the multiplicity of inputs that people have, right? Of course, they can run for office, but you vote for these various municipalities, various districts, various water boards, heck, even the PTA and the school council.
And if it doesn't exist, you can create it. And it's going to be hard. You might get pushback, but you can create it. I think that's one thing that I really advocate to folks is that if there's something missing in your community, create it.
Yeah.
Find other folks who have the same vision as you, the same shared goals, and create whatever it is that you need to be to solve that issue.
So I'm looking at at questions from various audience members. And yeah, right, folks are concerned or are thinking and want to be able to develop and expand their scope with in regards to how to do that, how to get involved, right? What would have been some examples, some things that we can point to be able to create it, to be able to instill this kind of search for social justice and racial justice that we are all talking about and we are all, trying to do now.
Yeah, I think there's, as I was telling you earlier about the board, like how there's different executive boards and things like that who are trying to solve different issues around the city. I myself am in wear different hats at different times. So for example, like there's this organization that I'm working with who is it's called the Outer Belt organization. And what we're trying to do is basically create a 200-mile hiking loop trail around the entire city and suburbs. And you would think, well, that's outdoors recreation. How does that matter? Well, then it matters because when you start looking at like obesity rates, diabetes rates, health rates of Latinos,
That's right.
we're always at like the worst spectrum, right?
That's right.
So
That's right.
I started thinking to myself, well, we need access. We don't necessarily always have safe, affordable access to the green spaces or like recreation.
Yeah.
So how can we connect these trails into our neighborhood, right? That's an example. And when I started going in there, I quickly find out that I'm going to these meetings or like trail connectivities, and I look around like, man, I'm clearly the only like Latino here, I belong to this other organization that called Music of the Americas, where we're trying to get classical music inside of Chicago public schools, right? Predominantly for Black and Latino students. And as we start going to and I have nothing to do with classical music, I just really want to give students more access to like different fields and different programs.
Yeah.
And I quickly find out when you go to the classical field, again, there's not enough Latinos or enough Black people in there. And it's like as you start kind of like going into the little things, you start finding out that we need more representation there. So we need folks we need you all to kind of like find where it is that what are your passions, right?
Yeah.
And you will most likely find something where you can fit in and start volunteering and end up becoming a board member or joining the associate board. And that's how you kind of start creating like change little by little.
Yeah, that's the thing about political power, right? Political power, by extension, political institutions. Political power and political institutions don't seat anything without a demand, right? And it's just the effect of having this lone Latino voice, right, in various areas, right? Just, however he can represent, having that person there is incredibly meaningful. And as you say, we need more.
We need more, right? And once you get that kind of like that number and power in numbers, right? You have an organization, and then you can set up those meetings with the elected officials. Then you start proposing, hey, we need more funding for music in public schools.
Yeah.
We need more funding for trail accessibility on the south side, right? This is where I'm trying to give you kind of like the step-by-step way of like how to kind of problem solve.
Yeah. Do you have to be from those communities to advocate in this way in government or in various aspects of political participation, even if informal?
You don't have to be part of those communities, and I say that because I myself, as I was kind of telling you all where I'm from, I've always felt that I don't necessarily belong, not just because I wasn't born here, but because like I've moved around the city and I moved to different states and I've studied in different states that when you come back here, people say, well, you're not from here. I'm like, I know I'm not from here, but this neighborhood reminds me of my neighborhood, or this neighborhood reminds me of like where I grew up.
How do I do that? Fingers, yeah, I'm clapping.
And so that's always been really important. And finding allies, right? Finding allies who have the same vision and goals as you do, I think is really important.
Yeah.
The strongest work that I've done has been with a diverse group of folks, whether it's on the southwest side or on the southeast side or in Pilsen. When you have a diverse coalition of folks who are like trying to solve this thing, when you put out different kind of perspective, it just makes it even more stronger.
Yeah.
That's really important.
I'd say that's sort of the real fascinating aspect about the Latino political identity, and I can speak confidently about this because I am engaged in the scholarship, and of course we teach this kind of stuff, and we have young scholars who are interested and intrigued by these questions. And so, at least it's been my experience, right, that the Latino community members, right, are looking for reasons to include rather than reasons to exclude, right? Like what is it that you want? How are you interested in advancing community interests? And I would say that there is strong support, encouragement, right, among the community, even if you're not from it. I myself, like I said, I come from Los Angeles. I went to San Francisco for college, Austin, Texas for grad school, and here I am in Chicago teaching as professor. And one of the things that I realized, right, by interacting with the various Latino communities, Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, whatever you call them, right, is that you don't have to be from them, right, to be of them, right, to be able to speak for them, right, and that's the real kind of interesting but magical aspect of political identity, right, and because Latinos themselves, right, Latinos, Latinxes, the community comprises various folks of various nationalities, right? Could you maybe talk about the nationalities, the diversity of Latino communities, and how this might potentially be a resource, for mobilization?
I think of a lot. I want to give you an example of something that used to kind of hinder me when I was younger. Some of you may have heard the dicho like "ni soy de aquí, ni soy de allá." I'm not from here, neither from there. And I actually started switching that in my head to soy de aquí y soy de allá. Like I am from here and I am from there. Because I'm from both, or I'm from all of them. Like I shouldn't not be from either
What are
places.
the two? Could you tell us what the two are?
For me being from Zacatecas, that's where I was born, and then me growing up in Chicago.
Zacatecas, Mexico.
Zacatecas, Mexico, And I started, when I was younger, and you have these issues of like, do you speak Spanish properly? Do you speak English properly? And I'm like, what if I could just speak both bad and good, So I wanted,
or you combine them into one.
Combine them into one, right?
Spanglish.
But I wanted to say this because that's important to finding solidarity with other communities, right? Okay. Because then you quickly start finding out that when you kind of go into that mindset, you're going to create more connection with more people who are different than you, right?
Yeah.
And in Chicago we have diverse Latino communities, right? We have Mexican Americans, we have Puerto Ricans, we have the Central American population that's growing, and that's that diversity of ideas, and what's really important as well too is that Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the country, right? We always say that viaducts or bridges or railroads divide neighborhoods, Black, Latino, white. But when you cross that viaduct or that bridge and you start creating meaningful connections, with folks in those different communities, I think that's when the real change starts happening.
Okay.
And we have definitely noticed that in our neighborhood. When you're consciously making an effort to say, hey, I want to make sure that these two communities that are divided by this invisible border, this viaduct or this bridge, are talking to each other in certain ways. And so you start kind of creating we started creating like town hall meetings.
Yeah.
Or having meetups at like the bowling arena or at the local park, and having people from both neighborhoods come together. And that's how you start creating like, in some cases like Black and brown solidarity. And that's important to creating that.
What Ismael, Mr. Cuevas here is talking about, I think is very fascinating to members of the audience and folks at home, because it gets at leveraging political identity, leveraging ethnic identity, right? Not only as a source for cultural celebration, right, and belonging, but also leveraging it as a political resource, right? So one of the things that we study in our political science classes, particularly when we're looking at Black and brown politics, is this concept known as linked fate, right? This connectedness that community members have with each other, their well-being, that being connected to the well-being of the community. You see it predominantly among Black communities. We're starting to see it among Hispanic, Latino, Latin communities. And we see it very strongly, right, among people of national groups, among Mexicans, among Puerto Ricans, Cuban Americans, Dominican Americans, Central Americans as well, right? And so what's fascinating here, where I'm getting from this, is that connectedness that folks have. Ismael here, for example, being really proud about being from Zacatecas. Yeah. That connectedness, right, to that identity enables folks to expand, right? And a case in point here in Chicago is the Illinois 4th Congressional District, right? Chuy Garcia's district. It is a combination of Mexican-American communities, but also Puerto Rican communities here in Chicago. Now, granted, the district is drawn pretty funny, like it goes around, right? It uses a freeway as a corridor to put together this constituency so that someone like Chuy Garcia might be elected to Congress, right? But again, that's a result of legislation, right? To create minority-majority districts. But in this example, right, the state government has identified that these two communities are more alike than different, to put them together, right? So one person can emerge to be a representative of the whole, right? And that's fascinating. So I'm wondering, Ismael, if you might be able to reflect on these kinds of, the way identity operates across contexts, right? So here we're talking about national groups, Mexican-American, Puerto Rican. We might wonder how identity operates on among gender as well, but on a generational scale, right? Do people of further generations identify with Latinos? What occurs to them? But also, I'm struck by a comment that Isabel here from the audience describes, that she's not surprised that Chicago has the better or the best proportion of Latino representation, largely because it's an urban center, right? And then the other cities that you described, Cicero, Melrose Park, Summit, right? These areas are suburban communities. Is there a significant difference, right, between suburban, urban Latino communities? And perhaps, those might break down by generation or gender.
I think that there's definitely a significant difference, and I think it's definitely access to resources. And by that I mean, like, is there leadership training institutes in that area, right? Is there places where you can learn how to mobilize, vote, how to register people to vote? I think that because in Chicago sometimes we forget that our ancestors, 2 or 3 generations ago, were fighting to become the first Black or brown elected officials, created these leadership academies or created training institutes to have folks like us, the new generation, partake in those, but those weren't all necessarily always reflected in the suburbs, right?
Okay.
And so, or even rural areas, right? Rural areas are also growing in Latino population. But again, those obstacles we talked about earlier, right? Income, working class, education levels, all these things,
right.
Racism and discrimination are real things that people have to face in suburbs where where people actually make you feel like you're the minority, even though you're the majority. So, those are things that we have to challenge within ourselves, and then challenge our family members and challenge our community to kind of rethink that.
Yeah, I want to emphasize something that Ismael here said for our audience here in person and also for our audience at home, is that there are various mechanisms, very sort of trappings, right? That this minority population right, will experience to a point where they're convinced that they're in the minority, even though in these various townships they're clearly in the majority, over 2/3, right, of Latino representation in these areas, right? That and then the disparities reflected in elected government. And one of the other things that I think we could of course afford some airtime to talk about is the census, right? And so what's occurring, I believe, in these communities, and hopefully you can kind of correct me and chime in, because you have personal experience with this, is that these communities are on average younger in age, right? And if folks are first generation, second generation American, they themselves are immigrants or their parents are immigrants, right? And so what the heck is voting? Right? What is voting going to do for me?
Yeah, I wanted to give 4 examples of elected officials who were, 3 elected officials who were basically millennials who came into power, and it was really trying to tap into like one, get registering people to vote, but also like the grassroots style campaigns, right? So I'll give you an example of Cesar Guerrero, who was 25 when he became the first Latino elected official in Joliet. Aaron Hernandez, he was 28. He beat a 27-year incumbent to become a state rep on the southwest side of Chicago. And then Alma Naya became the youngest woman and the first Latina in over 25 years to serve on the Cook County Board of Commissioners. And then it's kind of an outlier, but it still fits within this. Teresa Ma was the first Asian American woman elected to a Illinois General Assembly. And what makes all these folks, like the commonalities, that these were all grassroots campaigns using grassroots organizations where you literally had, if folks in the field office, trying to gather the vote by calling their tios and tias, hey, can you donate $5 to the campaign? Hey, I know that you go to this church. Can you introduce me and I'll stand outside of the church so it's not like interfering with church and state, and register folks, or like give them this pamphlet or give them a little speech of like who the elected official is. And so these grassroots level campaigns in Chicago and in the suburbs, I think have led to very positive outcomes, and I think they can continue to use that formula and obviously changing it up to whatever your community or town looks like to get more Latino representation.
So what I'm getting from here then, particularly in the suburban, sort of outlying Chicagoland areas, is that the youth, right, millennials, right, folks of younger generations, are doing this, right? They are identifying what writer and scholar E.E. Schatzschneider describes as potential power. There's power sort of scattered throughout communities.
I give this example of like something that like my mom and my dad always have said to me is like, I'm gonna say it in Spanish and translate it. Hazlo tú, mijo, porque yo no puedo. Like, you do it because I can't do it, basically. Or basically saying like, you have the opportunities that I didn't have. And I think that that's been true for a lot of these folks, right? That like their parents have been working class people their entire life who literally worked their butts off on a daily basis. And
That's right.
we are now some of us are now are college educated, right? We have credentials. We grew up in the schools. We know what it's like to be in a public school or private school. We can identify the sorts of issues that affect us. And I think that that's been really powerful for this next generation of folks that are 1 or 2 generations removed from an immigrant family. And I think that's really going to redefine what the city looks like and what the suburbs look like.
Yeah. And it's really fascinating, right? That there's this alliance or this symbiosis, right, between Latino communities that are citizens that are multiple generations, but also Latino immigrant undocumented communities, right? And folks from the undocumented community, for example, will say, well, I can't vote, but I can call 5 people and I can tell 5 people to vote, right? And that, in and of itself, right, picking up that potential power, organizing it in a way that it helps these organizations, these young leaders, right, to be able to like get, of course, to elected office, but provide that representation that, as we've been describing, is so crucial. I want to shift to transition our conversation to recommendations, and of course Ismael, has a fair amount of them because he's a player, right? He's a political operative in this environment, right? Magali, one of our audience members, talks about your mother's struggle in that government office, So off the bat, what could government be doing, the city government be doing, right, to expand services this way?
Yeah, I think the one of the biggest things that government can be doing in general is just having more representation, like across the boards, right? It doesn't have to just be the secretary answering the phones. It could be the commissioners or the managers, like basically the upper echelons of like each of these departments, right?
Yeah.
What's been really interesting over the last few years in city council in Chicago has been these reports that have been coming out of like of even analyzing the workforce of the city council of city hall, right? So like, how many Latinos work for streets and sanitation? Like the people who who take care of picking up garbage or fixing the streets and things like that. How many people work within the Department of Buildings? How many people of color work in public health sector? And so you start looking at these numbers, and every year it's like there's a massive disparity, right? Where it's like, I'm going to give you one that I have right here. The Department of Procurement Services stated that only 13% of the city's contracting opportunities were awarded to Latinos in 2020. Right. So even like, how do you make business with the city? How do you create those? How do you, if you own a company and you want to get a contract, how does that work? Right. So there's even disparities in that. So it doesn't always necessarily mean like in the political arena, even in the private sector.
Yeah.
Right. And those are really important gains that we need to start tackling as a new generation.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how government institutions and just these kind of elite methods, right? People in high offices, people as business leaders, right? They have this effect of bringing people in either to the economy or to society that then extends to the political system. For example, the Obama Foundation, right, has had the groundbreaking for its presidential center, right? The thing's going to be so big that it's not even a library; it's a center. It's a big old thing that has various social and racial justice, initiatives there, and they've made it a point to provide a percentage. I believe it's 30 to 35% of its contracts, of its contracting contracts, to minority-owned businesses, right? To really reflect the representation, to bring it up to par of the representation that people of color have here in Chicago.
And I want to highlight to that point is that it's in addition to building on the ability to have or kind of forcing the Obama Foundation to have this hiring percentage, you also have to have in place the organizations that are going to be able to provide those workers, right? So, for example, here in Chicago, you have the Chicago Women in the Trades. Chicago Women in the Trades is an organization led by a diverse group of women who is hiring, Black and brown women to work in the trades as carpenters, electricians, plumbers, welders.
Those are good paying jobs.
Really, really well paying jobs, and plugging them into that number, right? So I think I highlight that number because there was a recent interview and President Obama actually got to meet with some of the residents of our neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago, and it was really cool to see that interaction because if it wasn't for somebody a few years ago saying, hey, we need more women in the trades. We need more women carpenters, more women plumbers, more women in the unions, right? Now you have this. Now you have the foundation being able to grab people from there and give women these jobs. So again, I highlight this because there's vacuums everywhere we look, and it's gonna be up to you all and up to us to kind of figure out how to fill that.
And with regards to vacuums and recommendations, right, Ismael has described to us the various inputs that the political system has made available, right? And folks that are motivated enough, that are creative enough to be able to do that, can get in there, right? And, one of the things that I describe in my classes, right, ethnic identity is a political resource, right? All it would take is folks to become mobilized, For example, injustices mobilize folks. So we want to deconstruct and wonder how we might be able to get in there to really represent the core elements of a people, of a community, right? So Ismael, perhaps you could share with us, in these last couple of minutes, some thoughts on how we hear, right, our future leaders, hear students of DePaul University and students that are dialing in from other universities across Chicagoland, what we might be able to do now. What can we do as college students, but also when we graduate?
I think, for those of you who are in the university or in college, I think really building a foundation of knowledge. Right? I think that this is like those years, those golden years where you have like the time and the opportunity to like really absorb this information. I had this one time when my first political job in college was being an intern for Rollerman, and the chief of staff at the time, she was an older woman, older African American woman, and I was in the University of Wisconsin at the time, and that summer I went back to the south side to live with my parents, and then I was working in Little Village, so I would commute from like basically past Fort City to Little Village, and I would tell her, I'm like, man, sometimes I just want to like leave Madison, University of Wisconsin, and come back to Chicago because I can be with my friends and my family, and she's like, don't do it. I'm like, why not? She's like, I know Chicago's fun and everything, but like right now you have the opportunity to find and like sharpen all the tools that you need in your toolbox to come back and make the change, right, that you need. So that stuck with me forever because it's always like that preparation, right? Start preparing yourself for whatever it is that you want to do with your future. And you can start doing that now. One of the biggest things that I would say that identifying an area of need, whatever that area of need is in your neighborhood or in your community, or even within your own group of friends, right? Or your families, right? Finding those needs is really important because you have already the expertise and you don't necessarily need to have a master's or a PhD title behind it to become an expert in those areas. You can do that because you have lived it. And so finding those ways to connect that and to create that is going to be really, really crucial for you all to make those changes.
What I'm curious about, right, and perhaps this could be the last point that we explore, is this overlapping intersectional identities, right? And one of the things that we know, right, from enrollment statistics here at DePaul University, but in statistics of higher education across the country, is that Latinas, right, predominantly represent the Latino category in institutions of higher education, right? Latinas as well, are subject to incorporating various negative stereotypes about them, right? About them not being involved, about their family not wanting them to be in public education or higher education. How can we leverage some of that to become involved, right? How can we use some of that to identify these areas of need?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that we have to acknowledge, and that's it's been changing. It's something that I've had to also tackle myself, right? Like male privilege is a thing, and how to also use that privilege to advocate for other women and to advocate for other people in your neighborhood who don't necessarily identify as a man. So I think that that's been really crucial, right? I've always told my friends and family, like I've only had women bosses my entire life. So that's always been like the norm for me to have a female leader kind of giving the orders and working with me. But that's been really important in my formation, and it's been really important in like helping identify like women in your community who like can do a lot of change. So it's important to create that allyship with folks, because if we're not doing that, if we're not helping each other out, like I said, it's not, what does it work? You're not gonna move forward. So I think that I can't speak for women overall, but I can speak is that we do have to push each other along this process, right? Whether it's your colleagues or it's your friends and family, like you have to sometimes hold each other's hands and put your feet to the fire because it's going to be a long road, a difficult road. So that's been really crucial for my success in seeing my friends and family and colleagues succeed in their own right.
The burden that the communities of colors have in this political system is that we have to continuously keep fighting, right, for rights, for privileges, but also for expansion, because no one's going to give it to us. Right? We need to fight for it. And what my dear friend and colleague here, Mr. Ismael Cuevas, has done for us is he's provided a recipe on how to do this, right? He's given us the ingredients. He's given us the procedures. And in the end, let the pie cool for 5 minutes, and then you're ready to eat it. Now he has given us the story, so when you're looking up a recipe in the beginning, there's like there's like a story in the beginning.
A little snippet.
Yeah. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
It really makes it that much more approachable, and it really, makes us feel like we can do it ourselves. Members of the audience, members at home, please accompany me in thanking Mr. Cuevas here for providing us with this perspective, very powerful perspective. And thank you very much to all of you for participating. Could we get?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And my alarm here, that means that we are on time. And on behalf of the Center for Latino Research, the Political Science Department here at DePaul University, I'd like to extend my greatest gratitudes for you all. We look forward to seeing you in the next event. And thank you very much. Have a great day, and we'll catch you later.